But first of all, a little bit about myself. I work at a public policy think tank in Washington, D.C. Now, what is a think tank? It really is a research center. It's like a university without students. And, you know, once a year, my wife will say, "Do you get paid to do this?" Meaning read all day, speak on panels, give lectures around the U.S. And really, I just have the most stimulating job in the world. Now, I was brought into Ethics and Public Policy Center quite literally 30 years ago in 1985 at the rise of what in America was called the peak of the Christian right in politics. And the founder of the center said, we need an evangelical who knows something about theology and a lot about politics to coordinate our evangelical studies program. So he hired me to do that. In that position, I began to receive phone calls from members of the media and the press, really smart journalists who knew absolutely nothing about theology or about religious believers. I'll give you a few illustrations. About 20 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention in the United States was having a very public convention, and it got all over the news. And the Southern Baptists were re-emphasizing their understanding of what Paul meant between the relationship in the husband and wife, male headship, female submission. Well, the media had no comprehension of what this was all about. And I received a phone call from a reporter from the New York Times. She said, "You're director of the Evangelical Studies program there. What is going on with the Southern Baptists? Why are they oppressing women? Give me some help with this." And I said, well, first of all, look, in the book of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 and following, she said, "Stop right there. What was that book you just mentioned? Who's the author? Who's the publisher?" And I realized I had to start over. I said, wait, I'm sorry, it's not a book, it's a letter. And it's in a book called the New Testament, which follows the Old Testament. And in that letter, and literally as I spoke to her, I realized this world of discourse was totally unfamiliar to her. When you and I talk about how to understand Ephesians, we have a robust conversation. The word Ephesians was not in her vocabulary. Another time, a really smart political reporter from a magazine called The New Republic, which is one of the leading political literary magazines in the country, called me and said, "Can I come by to see you?" It was in the late 1980s when a gentleman named Pat Robertson was running for the President of the United States. And this gentleman wanted to know, what is a conservative evangelical? What is a charismatic evangelical? What is a fundamentalist Christian? What is a Pentecostal Christian? Who are these people and why are they voting? And so he came to my office, and for like an hour we talked about the differences between fundamentalists and evangelical Protestants. One of the best ways of understanding the difference between fundamentalists and evangelical Protestants is a friend of mine at Duke University Divinity School, Grant Wacker, says, an evangelical Christian is somebody who really, really, really likes Billy Graham. And a fundamentalist Christian is somebody who thinks Billy Graham is a liberal. And I told this guy, he didn't laugh, he didn't understand. He didn't know who Billy Graham was, and so it kind of hurt the point. But we talked for an hour about all these different varieties of the conservative Protestant universe and what the distinctions were. And I am serious when I tell you that at the end of that hour, he took his pen, he just closed it up, and he said, let's cut to the real issue. These people are sexually repressed, aren't they? I said, John, they all have 6 children. I said, they got over their Platonic view of the body about 50 years ago. In fact, I said, if you look in the latest issue of Christianity Today magazine, the #1 best-selling book is on human sexuality and marriage. Well, this is not the answer he wanted. He wanted to say, you know, the reason they're involved in politics is that they're repressed and they're angry, and now they're going to take it out on the voters of America. And it occurred to me at that point, you know, we need to help these people. And so I went to my boss and I said, you know, why don't we put on luncheons for journalists and invite them in and get the best scholars and academics we can find, So I got a grant from a foundation in Philadelphia called the Pew Foundation. And we hosted for several years luncheons with some of the best historians and theologians at the intersection of faith and public life. And, you know, if you want to get journalists to sit still for 2 hours, you got to feed them a good lunch. So we would have lunch in our big boardroom, about the size of this room, and we would cater a lunch, and then we would have an hour and a half of a lecture and Q&A. And so we did this for a couple of years, and I went back to the Pew Foundation, and I said, you know, we need to renew our grant. And the man said to me something a donor has never said to me before or since, which is he said, think bigger. I said, well, we had 4 lunches last year, we could have 6. No, he said, think bigger. I said, 8? And then he said this, think if money were not an object, what would you do? I said, well, I have to call you back. And so I went and talked to some people for about 3 weeks, and I said, if money were not an issue, what would we do for journalists? And we came up with this idea is, what if we got elite journalists out of New York and Washington, D.C., away from Washington and New York, in a nice venue, say like Miami Beach, Florida, on the water for 2 days. And we spent 2 days with 3 or 4 of the best academics in the world talking about religion and public life. And that's what we came up with. So I went back to the Pew Foundation and said, all right, here's what we want to do. It's going to cost you some money. They said, money's not an object. I said, what did you say? And they really meant it. And so for the first 3 years, beginning in 1999, they gave us almost a 7-figure grant to take journalists out of town. So what we do is we cover their cost, we cover their room and board, we do not cover the open bar. That would have done us in. And we spend literally 2 days. And by the way, it's invitation only 20 journalists. And they're handpicked by us. We try very hard to make it diverse politically, from conservative journals and newspapers, from liberal journals and newspapers. Religiously, we sprinkle the 20 in with Christian friends of mine in journalism, so that in case something comes up that I can't answer, they can. And so we've had Tim Keller, we've had Rick Warren, but it's not just about evangelicalism. It's about varieties of Islam. It's about religion in the Middle East. It's about understanding radical Islam and why does it exist. So we get the best scholars in the world on that. So the purpose of the Faith Angle Forum is not to evangelize. I need to underline that. It's to educate. And one of the reasons it works so well is that the journalists have come to realize that we're there to serve them. So that if you have a Mormon in the United States running for president, we obviously ought to get a leading Mormon scholar to tell us what Mormons believe. And so when Governor Mitt Romney was pretty even in the polls with President Obama, we had 2 sessions on understanding Mormonism. And it was riveting. And we had a scholar from Notre Dame University who himself was a member of the Latter-day Saints Church, a political scientist of some renown, explaining what Mormons think morally, politically, and culturally about life. Then we had a dialogue between an evangelical theologian and a Mormon scholar from Brigham Young University about the difference between evangelicals and Mormons. Well, that was fascinating. And the journalists just ate it up. They just loved it. So see, what we're trying to do is, whatever's in the news now at the intersection of faith and public life, we try to connect that subject with a scholar so that when they go back to write, they'll be writing about something they just learned about. So we don't just say, we think you need to know about St. Augustine, so we're going to do a session on St. Augustine. Unless one of the candidates in the current crop of candidates in the Republican Party says, by the way, my favorite philosopher is St. Augustine, we might say, well, maybe we ought to do a session on St. Augustine. But so we try to tie the topics to what's in the news now at the intersection of religion and public life. Another example, when Senator John McCain was running for president against President Barack Obama, you know, he had as his vice presidential candidate, some of you may know, is a woman named Sarah Palin. The worst choice for, I'm talking about the media. Not about, that's the next session, politics. Many of us had an infatuation with Sarah Palin for about 24 hours, and then it just went away. But at one point in the campaign, the news broke out that Sarah Palin's daughter, Bristol Palin, was pregnant out of wedlock. My phone just started ringing off the hook. The Religion Editor, Newsweek magazine, called and said, well, there goes the evangelical values voters' base for Senator McCain, isn't it, Michael? They're not going to vote for him now. I said, excuse me, wait a minute. You are confusing American Protestant fundamentalist legalistic Christianity with American evangelical Christianity. A fundamentalist Christian would say, we will hide this news and you will go live with your aunt and uncle and we'll keep it a secret. But I said in megachurches, at least once or twice a year, somebody has an unplanned pregnancy. And words like forgiveness and grace and redemption and restoration are used in that church for that woman and that child. I'm telling this to the reporter. I have a chance to actually preach the gospel pretending that I'm being objective. I was being objective. I said, you know, they really believe a lot in grace at these churches. People make mistakes all the time. She said, really? I thought the evangelicals just believed in politics, which is a real problem, by the way. I said, no, actually, before they believe in politics, they believe in this message, which is that all of us are broken and flawed and fallen, and we need a Redeemer. And I said, you should go right now to the website of Focus on the Family, where Dr. James Dobson has already put up a thing on their website that says, we commend the Palin family in Bristol for planning to bring this child to birth. It was already up on the website. So I said, no, the values voters will not now give up on Senator McCain because a young lady made a mistake. Well, this was news to the, this is being recorded. This was news to the religion editor of Newsweek, who's a friend of mine. She'll understand. An hour later, a reporter from National Public Radio called with the very same question, and I gave the very same answer. But it was striking. Why were they doing that? It's because up and down the halls of Newsweek magazine and of National Public Radio, everybody held that view. They all had this caricature in their head that evangelicals are legalistic, they're pharisaical, and they're embarrassed by people when they make mistakes. So we've had the opportunity through the Faith Angle program to sort of disabuse them of some of these things. And again, after that call, I realized the urgency and the need for what we were doing with the Faith Angle Forum, which is putting in front of really smart journalists, top scholars and leading pastors who could explain to them in a non-proselytizing way, just tell them what they believe and having people quiz them. We had the author of Purpose Driven Life, Rick Warren, there once, because the way I plan our subjects is I have a group of 8 journalist advisors. Twice a year we have lunch about 4 months before the next Faith Angle. And we say to them, okay, at the intersection of faith and public life, what do you all want to talk about at the next conference? And so we'll just get 8 or 9 or 10 ideas. And these are all really well-known journalists that you would recognize. From the Atlantic Monthly, New York Times, and the Washington Post, and Time Magazine. And they've all read a lot. So they'll say, you know, we're really curious about what is a megachurch? What is a megachurch? I said, well, I know Rick Warren. Maybe we can get him. Can you get Rick Warren to come? So Rick came. Well, the transcript's on our website. And the most riveting part of the transcript is journalists asking Rick Warren, who is going to hell? And they wouldn't let it go. And finally, Rick just said, you know, look, you need to take this up with Jesus. This is not my decision. And you need to really consult with Jesus about this question because I'm not going to be the one making the decision. But someone kept pressing him so hard that finally at one point, and I'm proud to say it's on the transcript, I said, I'm the moderator of these discussions, and I said, let me just interrupt to say that questions about eternal destination are best solved over drinks at the cocktail hour that will soon follow this session. And we moved on to other topics. because it was getting rather tense. They weren't going to let go until Rick said, you're all going to go to heaven. I mean, they weren't going to let it go. And quite literally did surround him at the cocktail hour. Rick was drinking lemonade and they were drinking scotch, talking about eternal destination. Now, so this is how the faith angle came into being. We saw a need. Now, how this applies to where you live and where you are, some of you may be in countries where there's such thing as a free press. This occurred to me as I was thinking about what to say. We have a situation in America where we do have such. But the idea came up, what could we do if resources were there to serve members of the journalistic community and help them do their job better? Now, I would just say to you confidentially, out of this, wonderful relationships between the scholars and the journalists have occurred, and they constantly call them for background research and information. And it's even true, without me mentioning names, people's personal lives have been utterly transformed by their encounters with some of the speakers we've had and some of the things they've read as a result of these meetings. But I will keep that off the record. You can ask me later off the record. But what I'm trying to underline here is that it's, the faith angle forum is an educational forum which leads to wonderful relationships with really important people who shape the news. And they have really important jobs as gatekeepers of information and knowledge that we all get our information from. So that's how it came into being. Now, let me speak, and by the way, you can interrupt me anytime with a question. Why is it the case, at least in the U.S., that we have this problem of journalists not understanding the world of religion and public life? One of the leading sociologists in the world, a sociologist of religion, is a man named Peter Berger. And Berger once made the observation that my friend Os Guinness has repeated probably here. You may have heard it, but Peter Berger once said that the most secular country in all the world is Sweden. Empirically, the most religious country in all the world is India, qua any kind of religion. He said America is a country of Indians ruled by Swedes. A country of Indians ruled. In other words, our elite culture in America, in the academy, in journalism, is Swedish. No offense to the Swedes in the room.
Thank you.
But you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so what's going on here is people have had really good educations in really elite institutions, but they have not learned some of the basic things that you and I take for granted every day in our walk in faith. Another book that came out about 25 years ago was written by a sociologist named James Hunter called Culture Wars. And in that book, James Hunter, professor at University of Virginia, describes what he calls two different worldviews operating in American society. One is what he called the Traditionalist Worldview, and in that worldview are conservative Jews, conservative Catholics, and conservative Protestants, who, while disagreeing doctrinally and theologically, hold basically the same moral framework in the Judeo-Christian tradition about moral values. And on the other side of the culture war are what he called more liberal, progressive, secular Jews, liberal Protestants, and liberal Catholics who hold the same, and also non-believers and secular people who hold similar worldviews. And he said there's a clash of these worldviews in the culture that he called a culture war, where people operate from two totally different views of seeing reality. Utterly opposite paradigms, utterly opposite worldviews, opposite religiously, opposite culturally, opposite morally, opposite socially, which leads to a real split and divide. And it leads then, as Hunter says, into a culture war and to a values war. Now, he wrote that book 25 years ago, and it's still the case in American society. And I highlight that book just to say that oftentimes the journalists that come to our Faith Angle forums, from their questions, you can tell what side of the culture war they're on and where the paradigms in their head, how they're being shaped and the way they're asking their questions. And knowing that helps a lot to know the people you're talking to and where they're coming from. Another book important in America that came out about 10 years ago was a book by an eminent historian named Gertrude Himmelfarb called One Nation, Two Cultures. One Nation, Two Cultures, where she describes, again, I apologize to my hosts, but these are all U.S. examples, but that's where I live. I certainly wouldn't pretend to tell you what your situation is. But Himmelfarb says that in American society there's one nation, but it's divided by two cultures. And one of these cultures grew out of the Puritan tradition in American society, and another one grew out of the 1960s and the revolt against authority and the rise of the counterculture. And she said, now in American society, those who were in the counterculture in the 60s are now the new elite culture, operating from a countercultural paradigm. And the new counterculture is traditionalists who hold to the Judeo-Christian framework. Now, as a former member of the counterculture myself, I'm now part of the traditionalist culture. I tell my friends I'm still a part of the counterculture because I hold to traditional values rooted in the Christian faith. But Himmelfarb's book is relevant, I think, even for your own situation, because I imagine there's some parallels in parts of Europe where you can see that there are these two cultures operating, and in those cultures are different frameworks of seeing reality. And I give you those examples to say, why in the world would a very smart political writer who's authored about 5 or 6 books come to me and think that the only reason evangelical Christians are involved in politics is because of some sexually repressed idea? I mean, this is a very smart man. It's because he's operating from this paradigm that has no clue about the universe that you and I move in all the time. And now, there are more open-minded people who actually, actually the ones who've come to the faith angle realize, this is a world I know nothing about. And some friends of mine and even some of my donors will say, I'm really glad you're talking to those liberal journalists. They're so biased. There is obviously bias in some media, but what I found mostly, there's really a lack of knowledge. They really don't know. And the best ones admit it. They say, I want to come to another faith angle. Literally, there were people in the room. Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, is the best-selling nonfiction book in the history of American publishing. And they were journalists in the room, had never heard of the book. And it had been at the New York Times bestseller list for several years. And there were some that said, I think I've heard of that guy. Doesn't he have a book that's been selling well? And so, some of them come and it's like they are really looking forward to meeting these people from another planet. And to them, it's like, I've heard of mega churches and I've heard of evangelicals. Are you one? I want to interview you. I mentioned the James Hunter book on culture wars and the Himmelfarb book on One Nation, Two Cultures just to highlight that oftentimes when we deal with the media, they're dealing with a framework, a worldview, and a paradigm that's totally foreign to the world that we move in. And it's really important for those of us who have our fellowship in the Christian faith, who are deeply involved in our churches and in our Bible studies, when we move into these worlds, to not just sort of use our own cliches to assume that they'll get it. As I told you earlier when I referenced Ephesians, the poor journalist, I don't know what book you're talking about. Who is the author? I love saying, well, there's a man named Apostle Paul. Some call him Paul of Tarsus. And you could tell she was scribbling and taking it. So our purpose then again in this whole adventure is to help journalists who, and by the way, some people say, why are you inviting him? Or why did you invite her? She wrote that awful piece 2 months ago. I said, that's precisely why we're inviting her. Precisely. She doesn't get it. She hasn't a clue. Don't tell her I said it. But people have said, you shouldn't invite that person. Someone once said to me, the person that we were just discussing is uneducatable. She's just give up, Michael. I said, look, I'm enough of an evangelical not to give up on anybody. And she will be invited back until she gets it. She still hasn't got it. Now, in America in year 2000, in our political campaigns, if you watch CNN, it seems to me it started in 2000, they would put up, when the election results are coming in, a red and blue map of America. And in the red and blue map, on the East Coast and the West Coast would be highlighted in blue. And those were all the people that voted for Democratic candidates. And then the red would be the heartland of America. And I often like to say that a lot of people in blue America are journalists. And they look at people in red America and they say, who in the world are these people? And they seem to be listening to all these Christian radio stations that I've never heard any of these stations. Well, you've never turned on your radio. And again, these are what are called, in the sociological parlance, new class elites who move in worlds that are utterly foreign to them. So what we're trying to do with the Faith Angle Forum is introduce these people who live in these worlds to a world that they know. And by the way, the best journalists are the ones who just dive in. And they say, this is so helpful, because I don't know any of these people. I've never read their books. And then out of it, articles grow out of it that are helpful to the readership of their secular publications. I'll give you one example that you will be familiar with, maybe. 2004, a New York Times columnist by the name of David Brooks called me up because he attends the Faith Angle. And I don't know if you know who he is, but he's a prominent writer for the New York Times twice a week. David called me up and said, Michael, I was just at a conference in Florida and I heard about a man named John Stott. Is he important? I said, well, David, let me put it to you this way. If evangelicals believe in a pope, the man they would pick is John Stott. He said, oh, great, I'm going to write a column about him. I said, well, now, wait a minute, David. If you're writing a column about evangelicals and politics, you'll probably want to write about the influence of Francis Schaeffer on evangelical political involvement. He said, that's not what I'm going to write about. I want to write about evangelicals as people. I said, what do you mean? He says, I have spoken on 3 evangelical Christian college campuses, and I'm struck by 2 things. Number 1, how smart the faculty is, and number 2, how smart the students are. And the readers of the New York Times don't know this, and I'm going to use John Stott as a window into the larger world of evangelicalism. So if you go Google the phrase, and the article came out, who is John Stott? If you Google that phrase, you'll read the column. Well, here's what happened. So he said, I'm going to write a column about it. So 2 days later, he calls me up. This is in 2004. He says, okay, I finished my column. Can I send it to you and see if I got it right? And so he sent me this piece on John Stott. And I promise you, I got chills. You'll do the same. It was so moving. And so I called him back and I said, David, it's like you've known him all your life. He said, well, I read none of his books. I said, in 2 days? He said, yes. I said, name them. Basic Christianity, Cross of Christ, Your Mind Matters. He started going through the names. He said, you know, that 2-volume biography of Stott I thought was a little overwritten, so I kind of gave up on that. You know, there's this biography of John that's literally 2 volumes. They're shorter versions now. But I said, I would only change one word. I mean, literally, it was an adjective. And I just said, that probably doesn't describe him quite right. It was one word in that whole column. Now, that would not have happened if David had not been a friend who I'd gotten to know through the Faith Angle Forum. And he'd heard about a man named John Stott, which to him was a foreign name. And he called me up and said, is he an important person I should probably think about? I said, yeah, he's the evangelical pope. And by the way, I did see Dr. Stott a year or 2 later. My dear brother, you're calling me the Pope now, are you? I said, well, John, it was a descriptive term. Also, a year later, David Brooks had a 2-hour breakfast with John Stott. I can't tell you much more about it other than that. It was a wonderful breakfast because they'd never met. And he wanted to meet this guy who wrote a column about him. By the way, the column, as you can imagine, in the pages of the New York Times, somebody's writing about John Stott, and it just bounced around the internet, just took off. But it didn't take off among New York Times readers, it took off among evangelicals who happened upon it, and then let everybody know that there's this important column. It is important for us in the Faith Angle Forum to document these kind of things because our donors want to know you're doing more than just going to a resort and having some nice conversations. We need to see tangible results of articles and stories that have been influenced by it. And so we have to measure these things. We used to have a file called the hit file. Every time we were mentioned or the journalists who came, we literally could tell that the story that they wrote grew out of the conference and it was influenced by their time there. We'd keep a big file of it because the foundation wanted to know, we need evidence. Now, by the way, in the world of ideas, evidence is not always readily available. Ideas have consequences, but sometimes you don't know the consequences until 20 years later. And I've said to donors, Freud, Darwin, Marx, they all had huge consequences in the 20th century, but you didn't know it right away. And you're telling me I've got to prove to you that we've really had an impact. They said, well, do the best you can. So we would try to keep a file of obvious stories. And we do that even today as best we can because literally the journalists go back and they write differently. And we ask them for evaluations at the end of the conference. Did this conference help you? Who would you like to recommend for future conferences? And they will say, I took 12 pages of notes and I've learned all kinds of things about a world of ideas that was unfamiliar to me. So we take note of that. I would just wind up by saying that these people in this world of, what Gertrude Himmelfarb calls this dominant elite culture, the people who spin the news, who are television movie producers, they are the cultural entrepreneurs in creating and marketing the news that we watch and read every day. These are people who, as I mentioned earlier, James Hunter said, live in a sort of a world of a progressive world, a postmodern world, that think those of us who are committed to an orthodox biblical faith are in another world. But if you invite them into that world, the best ones will come into that world and they'll say, tell me more. Now, is it the case that some have come and said, I'm unimpressed? A few, but mostly, most of them say, thank you very much because you've introduced me to something that seemed like a far distant land. And now I've met these, and by the way, meeting these people, meeting Tim Keller, meeting Rick Warren, does a world of good. Because if you've ever met or seen these people, they're wonderfully, wonderfully gracious and kind and friendly. Rick Warren came to the Faith Angle Forum wearing his Hawaiian t-shirt, and he literally embraced every journalist. Hey, brother, good to meet you. They were all sort of taken back. And he did something very smart. He had his assistant, he got the list of journalists that were coming, and he had his assistants go through every one of their names and find the last 3 articles they wrote. It was an interesting secret. I figured this out because Rick would go up, oh, great to see you. I love that review you wrote last week about something. Oh, you read my review? And then, oh, I love that editorial you just wrote for the Times. And he was doing that. And they were all like, whoa, you took that kind of interest in me. It was really quite, it was touching because he literally had read all those articles on the plane or somewhere and knew something about each one of them individually. Which meant that when he spoke, they listened, and they took him seriously. I thought you were going to say that she had not got it, and when will you know when she got it? And her writing changes. And that's right, her writing changes. And but the question was really, what is the criteria you use in picking the journalist? We don't have an objective sheet that we go through. What we do is we really try to get. I mean, there's some famous journalists that just don't have the time. But there's some now that hear about it and say, can I come? I'll give you, and I'll answer your question, but I'll give you one example. We just had a Faith Angle Forum 3 weeks ago. One of our sessions was on the theology and ideology of ISIS. And two months ago, a leading literary publication in America called The Atlantic Monthly, did a cover story on what ISIS really wants. by a young writer named Graham Wood. And I read the article, and two of the leading scholars he quoted in there from Princeton and the Brookings Institute in Washington. And I said, we should invite them to be our speakers. And we did, and they both said yes. And I said, why don't we invite Graham Wood? I don't know him, but he wrote this, it's the most well-read article in the Atlantic in the history of the Atlantic. We invited him. He immediately said, yo, I want to come. I thought, wow, I didn't think he would have the time. He said, no, actually, I want to come because the two people I quoted I've never met, I want to meet them. I've talked to them on the phone. But the criteria is simply we really aim for ideological balance. It's not a group of liberals getting together just to talk to each other. It's not a group of conservatives getting together just to talk to each other. So we look for balance in gender. We look for balance politically. We look for balance religiously. We look for balance in print media. And we look for balance in broadcast media. Now, we believe that print is more important than broadcast media. So we try to get people from the New York Times and the Washington Post and the leading publications. We read them, we keep up with different people, and if we think that they'll be interested, we will invite them. But we're consciously aware that, you know, we don't want 18 males and 2 females. We want to try to balance it out gender-wise. We want to balance it out. We'll look and see, oh, we've got too many from conservative magazines. We need to add more here. And you know, by the way, that's just not us being politically correct. It makes for a better conversation when you get people in the room who don't normally talk to each other in a civil manner. A man named Jeffrey Goldberg from the Atlantic Monthly said to me once, there's a conservative writer in America named Byron York, at the time was National Review, and there's a woman named Wendy Kaminer with a very left-wing journal called The American Prospect. Both of them asking questions of Rick Warren. And he said to me after the session, nowhere else in the world do you have a Wendy Kaminer with a Byron York talking to a megachurch pastor. And I took that as a compliment because we want to have diversity in the room in this kind of setting. And by the way, then if anybody is critical of it, they'll say, you know, you're just getting together all the people that you agree with. Well, it's not true. We're actually inviting people we don't agree with, but we want them to be in dialogue with the others. And so they like it because they don't find occasions. And by the way, in America, as you know, on our TV programs, there's a lot of this shouting, and we don't have that at the Faith Angle Forum. Each session is 2.5 hours long. So we begin on a Sunday night with reception and dinner, just totally casual, no lecture. And then we begin, our first session is Monday morning from 9 in the morning till noon with a 15-minute break in between. So there's literally time to hear the lectures and have the Q&A. There's really time for engagement with each other and with the scholars. And then in the afternoon, we do it after lunch, and then we do it Tuesday morning, and they leave. So they're in Sunday afternoon, they're out Tuesday afternoon. It's a good formula. By the way, I have a funny story about that. When I first got this big grant from the Pew Foundation, I called some journalists in for lunch. I said, you know, if we got this big grant and we held this conference, we could start on a Friday, and we could end Sunday. And one of the journalists said, wait a minute, aren't you a family values guy? I said, yeah. Why do you want to take me away from my family on the weekend? I said, well, can you get away during the week? He said, I'm the bureau chief of the Boston Globe. I can go wherever I want to during the week. And you know, that was worth its weight in gold. He was right. Don't do it on the weekend. Which is, I had made the earlier point that I felt that print media was more important than broadcast media. No offense to the announcers or radio hosts or TV producers that are here today. Keep up the good work. However, and look, I'm willing to be persuaded otherwise, but it just seems to me the case that something that's printed out, passed around, read, meditated on, thought about, reflected on, an essay in the Atlantic Monthly on what ISIS really believes, that is deep and profound and exhaustive. You read that essay and you think I see where they're coming from, and it's not good. That is more profound than a 20-minute special on TV that quickly goes up. A lot of people saw it, but they didn't go as deep as the printed page did. And so that's the argument for that. But you know, I'm totally aware of the fact that the 24/7 news cycle is, I want everybody to come, print and broadcast. And And since this is being recorded, I'd like to say to my friends in the broadcast media who are now listening to this, you will be invited back to Faith Angle. But yeah, that's just sort of the discussion there, is that ideas have consequences to most often the printed word as opposed to fast word. And because it's the printed word that the elite media stops, looks. Let's put it this way: that ISIS article in the Atlantic is then read by reporters at the New York Times, who then write about ISIS in the pages of the Times. So it trickles down, which is, what is the process of selection for picking the journalists, and do they have to pay to come? No, they do not have to pay. We have a grant that we cover their airfare, their hotel, and their meals. As I said earlier, we do not cover their bar tab. We'd otherwise be wiped out. Now, there are journalists, especially you all would be, of course, obviously familiar with The Economist magazine. The Washington editor of The Economist comes almost every time and will not allow us to pay his expenses, because his editors won't, for fear that we're trying to influence a story. And of course, we're glad not to pay his expenses. And some journalists have come. We've covered their expenses, and they decided to do a story on one of the speakers, and they say, we're going to give our money back to you because we don't want to look like we paid for this story. No, that I paid for their story. So they will actually send the money back to us. Now, the process of selection, as I mentioned earlier, is simply we try to make it politically diverse, theologically, I won't say theologically, religiously diverse, diversity of gender. We try to get in the room a mix of people. We aim for the best newspapers and magazines that we can, because those are the most important media outlets, and then we go from there. By the way, to get 20 journalists to come for 2 days, to take that amount of time, even though you're paying away, it's a lot of time for them if you're on deadline all the time. We have to sometimes invite over 50. In other words, a lot just say, hey, thanks, I wish I could come, but I'm finishing a book, or I'm going to Europe, or I'll be traveling, or I'll be in Iraq. We get all kinds of excuses. So they'll say, please keep me on the list. So what we do is we send the invitation, we roll them out. We start with 20 names, and we invite, and we start getting no's, we'll start inviting others. But among our team, we'll discuss people. We'll say, this person has never been, or this person's been 14 times. Do you think we still have to keep inviting them back? And so we do get repeat people because we want them there, because they're very, very important opinion shapers. And then we try to add new people. And so we'll discuss it among ourselves, and we'll have a dialogue. We need more balance. We don't have enough diversity politically or print and broadcast media. But we're trying to reach the elite media. And by the way, the real struggle in this now has been the new shape of the media, as you suggested, with the new rise of social media. A lot of people are from, we'll list their names and their affiliation, and a lot of it's .com, realclearpolitics.com, dailybeast.com, and that used to not be the case. And now these people are not with magazines anymore. The magazines have folded and become websites. And so we're more and more getting people whose position is really on the web, but they're the blogs and the outlets on the web that are the most trafficked, and that's what we're shooting for. You were looking at our website, thank you very much, and on the website you notice that we put up transcripts. We've not only put up the transcripts, we put up the audio, but in the transcript something's very important, especially in the ISIS section. 2 or 3 times the scholar would say, what I'm about to say is off the record. So our transcriber will stop, let the transcript go, and then I'll say, back on the record now, right, sir? And he'll say yes. So off the record stuff is not on there. And that's to protect, by the way, it wasn't at this one, but another discussion some years ago about radical Islam, where the scholar from Princeton said, I would like to go off the record, and another question came up and he said, I'd like to go off the record, and another question came up and said, I want him to say is go off the record, and somebody said, what does it say about a faith that every time you say something about it, you got to go off the record? And he said, no comment. But yes, what we do afterwards is we transcribe the lectures, and then I moderate the dialogue between the 20 journalists. And then it's, by the way, very rarely that somebody will go off the record. It's very rare. And then we'll transcribe that, and then we'll send it to the speaker and say, did we get your transcript right? By the way, here's another key. I say to them, if you'll look at the transcript and tell us if we got your presentation just right, if there are any words you want to change, let us know. And as soon as you approve that transcript, I'll send you your honorarium. But not until then. This was a lesson hard learned. You know, speaker speaks, you hand them their honorarium, they leave, you send them the transcript, and they never get back to you. And we learned that they pay attention if you say, I'll pay you as soon as you approve your transcript. And so we've just finished the transcripts of what we did 3 weeks ago will go up this week. I mean, literally, they're going to go up on our website. The whole thing on ISIS. Another speaker, by the way, some of you will have heard of course, is the retired Rabbi of Great Britain, was Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, was at our last Faith Angle. Wow, was he riveting. His piece was called A Religious Response to Religious Violence. Now that won't go up until the middle of June because he has a new book coming out on that very subject, and he wants us to hold the transcript until the book comes out. So people will buy the book instead of reading our transcript. But that's how we do it, and the journalists know that it's all being recorded, and that what they have to say will no doubt go up. And so if you go through the transcripts, you'll see the dialogue, which is really, 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 if I might say so, riveting, because they ask really honest questions, and they really want to know. And it's most of the time, except for that one time I described with Rick Warren, most of the time it's really very civil. I mean, it really is a really fresh, help me understand kind of questions. And by the way, the scholars leave, they just love it because they've been in the room with 20 of the most important journalists in the country, and their academic work is being shown to these people, and these people get their name and they call them back for background research and to quote them. And so that's an answer. Then, first of all, any recommendations how we might do it ourselves locally? And secondly, what do I think about Christian magazines, Christian media? Number one, how you can do it locally is we began small. We just hosted luncheons. And really, you want the journalists to know this is not a setup. We're not bringing you in here and by the time you leave, we're going to hand you the 4 spiritual laws. You know, this is an attempt to help you. Not in a patronizing way, but we know that you'd probably like to hear this historian explain X. So you start small and you host luncheons and you invite in the journalists that you know and don't know and say, come for a free lunch. And then ours, we were blessed by that phone conversation where I had a program officer at a major foundation say, I think you should think bigger. By the way, if there are any program officers in here today who want me to think bigger, I'll be glad to continue to do so. And then secondly, what do I think about Christian media? I'm all for it. I read Christian magazines faithfully. But I'm also believe vocationally it's important for Christians to infiltrate the secular media and to be salt and light there. And we have some wonderfully gifted believers in the States who work for secular media. And it's a blessing to have them there because in staff meetings and editorial meetings, they're able to say, no, I don't think that's right. I think what we want to do is X, not that. And so being salt and light in the world is important, but Christians who are called to write for Christian magazines are doing something vocationally important also. So I'm for both. So the questions were, how often do we do the forums? What's the follow-up like after, in between forums? What do I do with my time? No, so how often we do it is twice a year, fall and spring. The follow-up is something we're working on, and that is this, that we really want to do a better job of getting these transcripts out to people who want to get a good summary of the question of ISIS, its theology and their view of eschatology, which ISIS is rooted in an eschatological view of the end of time, which was really revealing for the reporters. Both of these scholars said you cannot understand ISIS until you understand them religiously. They really mean what they're doing. And it was a riveting discussion. It was a very depressing discussion. So the follow-up is, one, we're trying to do a better job of getting the material out to more people through social media, through Facebook, through Twitter, worlds that I'm learning. And then also just to to other journalists who weren't there, who could get a good short summary of, I think if you read our transcript of ISIS, you'll get a great summary of what's going on with ISIL. Other countries, have we thought about doing it in other countries? You know, something interesting happened to us a year and a half ago. We had a session on who is Pope Francis. And so one of the leading biographers at the time was a man from Britain named John Valery, who wrote a book called Untying the Knots, and it was on the life of Pope Francis. So he was one of our speakers. And then we had in America, a leading reporter for the Vatican is a man named John Allen, who's considered the best reporter of everything that's going on in Rome and the Vatican. We had the two of them together. And John Allen, after that dialogue, one of the journalists raised her hand and she said, I have learned more in the last 2 hours about Pope Francis than I've learned in the last year reading about this man. And John Valery got so excited. We had a foundation there from Philadelphia, the Templeton Foundation, we're observing. And he said, we have got to do this in Europe. We got to do this in Britain. We don't have this, we don't have this. And I said, talk to the guy from Templeton. And so he did, and we're talking about it. I think I can say on the record that the Templeton Foundation is very slow and bureaucratic about getting back to you. You heard me, right? I can say that publicly, and they've heard it from me privately. We've talked about, and my good friend Charlie and I were just talking about the other night about how to do this. By the way, if we were to do it in Europe, we wouldn't do it in London. Again, people say, well, why do you save money and do it in Washington? Who will come? I mean, part of the draw is get away with these journalists you have never met, and you want to meet them, and you hear they're going. In other words, somebody once said to me, you'd save a lot of money if you did it at the nice hotel in downtown D.C. Yeah, they'd come for about an hour and get up and go back to their office. And so you got to sort of trap them in a nice venue. And by the way, when they write and say, I can come for 2 of the sessions, we say, well, you can't come. You come for the whole thing or you don't come at all. We don't want people kind of coming and then flying out in the middle of the 3rd session.